Good morning, afternoon, and evening. You are tuning into the Economic Podcast for Gen Z. I am your host, Stefan Bartel, and today I am joined with Chris Herrmann. Chris, how are you doing? Can you please take the time to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into your wonderful banner of European Council on Foreign Relations and some transatlantic information.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Great to see you again. We haven't seen each other in a long time. Hopefully, the next time I'm in Europe, we can get together for a coffee or more importantly, a beer, probably. Yes, I'm really happy to be here. I work for the European Council on Foreign Relations, as you can see. We opened a Washington office 2 years ago to sort of begin to serve as a launch pad here for our many colleagues across our 7 European offices, as well as, and I think most importantly, and this is probably what's most interesting for our conversation today, dive into the domestic politics of foreign policy here in the US, because obviously the transatlantic relationship is quite important and at the moment uh, quite tenuous. And so we sort of, do a lot of research and work on what's going on here in the US, how that translates to foreign policy towards Europe, towards the rest of the world, and then also, areas of convergence where Europe can sort of take advantage of the changing moment to, instead of just see these changes as challenges, try to see them as opportunities going forward. So that's what I do. It's a very small but mighty office. There's three of us, but hopefully we're growing in our both influence and size soon. Yeah.
No, that's great. So let's jump right into it. We had mentioned the transatlantic relationship. Do you want to maybe help us define that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So the U.S. and Europe are obviously very closely linked, and have been, for we can just start with the post World War II period. 80 years of very close ties. Those things are changing. But I do think, Donald Trump has been quite abrasive with his language since 2016, even, using words like freeloaders and the like. But there is a changing mood amongst the populace within the United States that feels quite similarly. It's not just a make America great again, America first movement that has started to see American citizens say, hey, what are we doing all over the country? Or sorry, what are we doing all over the world? We don't really want to be the world police. We want to sort of rein that in and focus on America. If you look at some of the political commentary from the left, it's why do we always have money for war but not have money for schools? And this applies to the American relationship with Europe because it is seen as though we are the protectors of Europe, and we are the protectors of Europe, and we have been. Right? NATO is as an alliance, but it's sort of, the U.S. is the backstop. The U.S. is the provider of not just intelligence, mobility, but most decision making as well historically. So this is quite important to Europe. It's if you listen to many politicians speak at the moment, it's existential, right? This is a change. This is the changing tide, and how do Europeans defend themselves with less America, as my former colleague Kami Grand called it, but how do they defend themselves generally in a changing world where the U.S. might not be seen as the same trusted partner as it was for the first 70 years after World War II?
So thanks for setting the stage there. From my understanding, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s opened up the moment for what John Mearsheimer likes to call the unipolar moment. That kind of went until 2017, and we saw Trump was elected 2016, got into office in 2017. That this really began to change how politics on the international stage was being perceived and performed. the crisis between Ukraine and Russia kind of added on into that in 2022, alongside right off the bat of a COVID crisis. Do you think that it would have been, regardless if Trump was elected or not, that we would have seen tensions in the transatlantic relationship?
Hmm. Um, I think that tensions, I don't know if we would have necessarily seen tensions. And I think that, I guess my evidence for that is when Biden was elected, his entire sort of pitch was that America is back. He was saying that both domestically, but he was also signaling that to our allies and partners, both in Europe and across the world. Um, so I'm not, and right, Biden was in many ways seen as a continuation of the Obama sort of foreign policy doctrine, especially in Europe. So I don't know if we would necessarily see tensions, but sort of as I mentioned, there is sort of a, I think there was a latent desire to not be the world's policeman anymore. I think that there would have been a move towards burden sharing.
Mhm.
It would have been slower. The Europeans would have been able to slow walk the US a lot. The US would not necessarily have demeaned the Europeans and forced the issue. But I think we sort of would have moved towards. I think there's a desire towards a security relationship that's much more collaborative. I mean, it is very collaborative within NATO, but I think there is, like I said, on both the left and the right, there is really a feeling that the U.S. is doing more than its fair share. So tensions is an interesting word. I definitely do not think that without Trump we would have economic tensions with the Europeans, and I think that is, um, you know, that is the place where the Europeans have the most power, but they can't really use that. They've struggled to make the decision to use their leverage against the United States in the economic realm because it's sort of inextricably linked to the security realm, and this is sort of one of Trump's um, sort of he's the United States is uniquely positioned as the security guarantor. So he's able to use this cross domain bargaining essentially, um, where he can just put tariffs on European goods, and Europe is the U.S.'s largest market. They could clap back with tariffs of their own, but then they might upset the security relationship, which is much more difficult to stomach, I guess, than the economic one.
This is a good segue to bring up all of last year, the entire media was hyper focused on tariffs and Liberation Day. Can you help explain what Liberation Day was supposed to be and what it has turned out to be, going more than, I believe it was February it began, so we're more than a year into what Liberation Day was sold to be.
Yeah, I think Liberation Day liberated Americans of their money, but it was supposed to liberate us. In, um, but it was supposed to liberate us from unfair trade practices from around the world. Trump has, if you go back and read Trump from before his political sort of moment in the 2015, he's, even if you go back to the 80s when he's being interviewed, he's always hated tariffs, but he has a specific dislike for the European Union, and so this was like a sort of a match made in heaven for him, which was he can put tariffs on an organization or an institution that he despises because they didn't let him build a retaining wall on his golf course in 2011, I believe. And so from then, the EU has been like a thorn in his side. And so, uh, putting tariffs, sort of blanket tariffs on European goods was uh, liberating in some way. Interestingly enough, though, this, like I said, this was the where the Europeans had the most power, and so there's the meeting that the European Union, sorry, I guess most of the, I guess Macron was there, the French, the Germans, even I don't think that, I'm not sure if the Brits were there, but in Turnberry, um, a lot of Europeans thought, okay, this is the moment. We're going to use maybe even the ACI, the anti-coercion instrument. Maybe the Europeans are going to clap back with their own tariffs. And instead, they just sort of accepted, instead of 20% tariffs, we're going to accept 15% tariffs and we're going to walk away with it because, in the end, those tariffs are hurting Americans, not hurting Europeans necessarily.
Well, to put the economics in the economic podcast for Gen Z, a tariff is a tax on consumers. And so
Exactly.
if the idea is to protect the heartland or Trump voters, whose majority of their consumer goods are from abroad, they're being served a tax. They're being served a tax for the gentleman they voted for. Is there a psychology there in how this works? Or I mean, because the whole idea, from my understanding, was that the tariffs were designed to be fast and quick so that everyone kind of other institutions don't have enough space and time to think them through. And then in order to revive some manufacturing sector that the US had lost a long time ago. I mean, I write every now and then concerning manufacturing in the US, and it still hasn't returned, and we're a year into this. So, what do you think that this was just one big gambit to have other institutions buckle down outside the US, or?
Interesting. Actually, I think that most of the data is showing that manufacturing is actually down, and actually a lot of that is because of the tariffs on inputs.
Mhm.
Most of the American manufacturing is not. It requires inputs from abroad,
Mhm.
inputs from Canada, specifically inputs from Mexico. Right, our car manufacturing industry was thrown into an absolute tailspin, seeing as the entire infrastructure of our car manufacturing of those car manufacturing plants and the way in which the cars were designed is that some of the parts. I remember looking at the Ford F-150, I think, which is one of the best selling cars in America. Pieces from that car or parts of the car across the border between either Canada and the United States or United States and Mexico like 60 times. There were 60 different transfers of the border, which was just untenable from a, how are you going to tariff each time this
Yeah.
across the border, each piece? Um, so you're totally correct. Manufacturing hasn't really come back. There is some protectionism, obviously, from the theoretical standpoint. Yes, you can protect your industries here. That's just not where American industry is, right? America is a service industry for the most part. We don't have much manufacturing. But I think it is important to know that when Trump put tariffs on, when Trump put let's just look at China tariffs for a second. When Trump put tariffs on China in the first term,
Mhm.
when the Biden administration came in, they didn't take those tariffs away. They actually increased some of those tariffs under the sort of, I wouldn't say guise, but in the name of national security. Jake Sullivan talked about a small yard or the high fence. These are really important technologies, and we need to protect them at all costs. So tariffs can still be used as a tool, and I think the Biden administration used them in a very sort of specific, targeted way, which is very different from the Liberation Day tariffs, as you were saying. They're broad and sweeping, and they touched everything from shirts coming from Thailand to wine coming from France, and Americans aren't going to all of a sudden stop drinking French wine, and Americans aren't going to all of a sudden want their T-shirts to be hand sewn in factories in the Northeast. This isn't the 19th century anymore, and so it really has impacted the lowest quartile of Americans the most, right? Because they are paying more for consumer goods in a way that we haven't really, in many ways unnecessarily, but in a way that we haven't seen. The other part to this is that after Liberation Day, and I think this is something that the media hasn't really talked about because, number one, there's way too many things going on that in the Trump administration, from things going on here in DC with the reflecting pool, for example, or we have a war in Iran, we have what's going on currently on the Crimean Peninsula with Ukraine. Like, there's a lot of news, but the Trump administration has not been able to, but they have actually taken down a lot of these tariffs through negotiation. And Peter Navarro has, he said, oh, we'd have 90 deals in 90 days. That didn't happen. But now we're over a year in, I think actually 14 months in. There have been some deals that are made, and for the most part, a lot of them have been reducing the tariff, the overall tariff rate, because it does hurt American consumers, and like I said, it hurts the American manufacturers who need those inputs. um, so I think that's sort of that's one way to look at this multi-layered sort of impact of tariffs and the use of tariffs in this administration.
You had mentioned China on the western side of the U.S. The Liberation Day tariffs, the current debacle of funding Ukraine and Russia in this conflict, the renewed crisis going on in Iran now. How does this transatlantic relationship look at all these different quagmires across the world? I mean, regards with containing China, for example, do you think the EU is proclaimed to come and help America in ensuring that China there's some containment policy after Liberation Day?
Huh. Okay, so I do think that the Europeans would love to be involved in some way because they do feel as though China is a threat in many ways, militarily, but specifically the Trump administration would be happy to tell the Europeans to stay home. Um, we don't need your boats, we don't need your men, we don't need any type of military support in the Indo-Pacific. Um, at least that's what I believe they would have said before the war in Iran. Now, the war in Iran might have changed. I don't think the war in Iran would have changed their position. I still don't think that the Trump administration would want help, need help, ask for help. But we have used a lot of weapons. We have actually moved many of our deterring forces from South Korea or the Indo-Pacific broadly into the Middle East. But I don't, from a military perspective, the United States does not view itself as needing Europe, and specifically, this administration doesn't really view um, partners and allies in the same way as a traditional, as the Biden administration did, as the Obama administration did, even as the George W. Bush administration did. They were much more reliant on partners and encouraging of collaboration. Economically, this is a much different question. Um, Europe's in a really hard position. They're facing coercion from the United States economically with the tariffs, as we said. They're also facing some, this weird security coercion. Um, but the Chinese, okay, so now what do the Europeans do? Do they turn to China? Do they get stuck in a China trap, right? And this is a really difficult part for the Europeans because it's 20, the EU specifically, right? 27 different countries who all have their own national interests to, think about. And so this is a question. The ACI I mentioned before was created devised as an instrument to use against the Chinese, and the two times the Europeans almost used it was against the United States. So Europe's in a tough position here, and I don't really know if the United States is welcoming European help towards deterring China. This is really, the United States sees itself as its own. And so now Europe has to become a player on its own, and this is quite difficult. I have a great colleague, Tobias Gurka, who just wrote a great paper on all of the various different cards that the Europeans have to play against China if and when and how during all of during a variety of different scenarios of China using their economic coercive powers against the Europeans. So I would totally recommend reading it. But I guess that's sort of the position. I don't really know if the United States is going to utilize Europe as a supporting role.
The pivot was always, I recall, under Hillary Clinton, was that when she was Secretary of State under Obama, that the US must pivot now to Asia and it must focus a lot more of attention on Asia.
We've been doing that for like 20 years, and I haven't seen a change.
The
It's a
the
slow
Euro
pivot. It's a slow pivot.
the European isolation, I guess one could call it, is, well, let me frame it like this. The America First movement has led to a relative America Alone movement, whether it is disentangling from alliances or actively involving itself in other areas. How does it go forward?
Um, the America First movement is quite interesting because it's a really good slogan, a really good political slogan that is very complicated in its policies. And, um, if you would listen to someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson, Trump is actually not even an American first actor anymore. Um, that they're split with him. They have many. They actually have had multiple splits with him, but right, this war in Iran is sort of the biggest split of being anti-American first, anti-peace, anti-get out of the Middle East. So where does the movement go? I'm not sure. What is interesting is that there is an American, as I've tried to allude, that the left has its own America First, at least ideologically America First group and faction, um, that is starting to get more and more political power. Actually, in the this upcoming midterm election, right? There's 470 elections across the United States. That's between the House and the Senate. There's a lot of different ideologies. There's a lot of different political strategies being put out. And you're seeing a good bunch of people on both the left and the right, but less so on the right because it's tough to break from Donald Trump during an election cycle when he's the president. But on the left, you're seeing a lot of diversity. Some folks really do believe that, in the America First foreign policies of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson, but they're, Democrats. So I'm not sure where it goes, but it is a growing movement amongst the populace, and it is a super effective political slogan. To talk about we need to spend money at home and not abroad. You're seeing a variety of different ways that people are doing this. I think one Democrat that is particularly interesting from my perspective is he's a Democratic Senate candidate from Texas. The Democrats haven't won a statewide election in Texas since 1994. So if somehow he wins, this would be quite crazy. But how he talks about foreign policy is that he folds every foreign policy question that he fields, be it about Iran, be it about Venezuela, be it about tariffs. It's all about what does this mean for my domestic constituents, right? So he's asked a question about the war in Iran. His immediate response is somehow there's always money for war, but not money for the schools here. He gets asked a question about the U.S. military operation in Venezuela to get Maduro, and he responds by saying, "Oh, look, the oil billionaires again are controlling your foreign policy, but somehow we don't have money to spend to fix our roads at home and this type of thing." And so this is to me, this is slightly, it's adjacent to the America First movement in terms of the way in which they're talking about policies.
Who is the gentleman at hand? The senator?
Sorry, his name is James. His name is James Tallarico.
Okay. I'll have to look
James
into
Tallarico.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah, Texas state politics, that escapes me, but has he been in politics prior?
No. So he's a state representative who just won the Democratic primary, and he's going up against it's an open Senate seat now because the Republican incumbent lost his primary. So you have Ken Paxton on the right, who is seen as a pretty bad candidate. He's basically Trump without the likability. Mm-hmm. And then you have this James Tallarico character. And so Democrats are sort of seeing this as a potential pickup seat, which would be quite important for their control of the Senate or potential control of the Senate. But also, I think James Tallarico is analytically interesting because he is talking about foreign policy in a way that most politicians aren't, right? The majority of the Democratic Party mostly talks their responses to the war in Iran were, oh, it's illegal to go to Iran. It's illegal for the Trump to start a war. We should, do a war powers resolution in Congress. Like he's using the power of the presidency inappropriately. And that doesn't really feel salient to the American voter. Like, oh, Trump did a bad thing. Let's talk about the legalese,
Mhm.
right? When really it feels to me, and this is what's interesting about Tallarico, is that this isn't about the legalese. This is about what the U.S. government is choosing to do, how the U.S. government is prioritizing intervening abroad versus focusing at home. And that duality, I think will be salient with voters. We'll see in November, but just generally, I think a lot of other Democrats are starting to see, oh, this is an interesting way and maybe a better way to politically frame these policy issues that are going on around the world.
To lean into the upcoming midterm elections that'll take place in roughly 4 months. I believe it's historical that typically the president is a Republican. The both seats or both chambers of the Congress are Republican, so they're set to lose either one or two seats, which could in effect make the current administration a lame duck administration going forward. You had mentioned Texas. I mean, there are several states and different seats open, of course. If the Democrats win both the Congress or both the House of Representatives and the Senate, do you think an impeachment will be in order and take effect?
Okay, so I'll take that. Just I'll get there in a second. So the first thing is, yeah, it's very normal for um, a president to, in the midterm election following his presidency, to immediately lose one of the houses. That this has happened a lot. Um, for Trump is a historically unpopular president in this term. The chance and there is an extremely tight margin in the House. This is part of the Trump administration's sort of desire to gerrymander and add more Republican seats in the House because they know that the sort of general sentiment amongst the voting crowd in the midterm is going to be against the incumbent. And so the Democrats are set to pick up the House. I would say there's a very high likelihood of them picking up the House, even with all this sort of seat swapping and gerrymandering and uh, sort of packing of the districts. The House is where impeachment could be filed. I think that there are some serious conversations within the Democratic Party of, is filing an impeachment politically successful for 2028, right? It was seen as a sideshow in 2020. It is something that Trump has lambasted for now 6 years as this hoax, the impeachment hoax. He has said that this is a political attack, and it's hard for the normal American in Nebraska or Colorado to not see it as that, because right, it's a quid pro quo. He called this guy. He called this Ukrainian president. He said, we're not going to give you the weapons. Coincidentally, this became very important in 2022. But right, the convoluted nature and sort of the very nuanced nature of this quid pro quo argument, and then the immediate failure at the trial in the Senate was, I think, maybe this is me getting ahead of my skis, but I think it was a political it was good for Trump in that long run. It wasn't good for Trump in 2020, but who knows? It could have been COVID. It could have been the impeachment. What impacted the voters there? But it allowed him to, in 2024, it allowed him to continue to say, this is a witch hunt. And he was able to fold the impeachment from 2020 right into the federal prosecutions that he was facing in 2024, and all of it, it's a witch hunt, it's a witch trial, it's right. And so I think that the Democrats are thinking, okay, should we file letters of impeachment, should we not? Now, you brought up the Senate, and the Senate is much more difficult for the Democrats to win. Just generally, there's an overall skew towards the Republicans at this current moment in American history for the Senate, because it over indexes towards small underpopulated states, right? California has the same senators as Wyoming, even though California has 40 million people and Wyoming doesn't even have a million. With that said, I find there to be impeachable offenses from this Trump administration, like monthly. It may be weekly, some weeks. I don't think that they'll get a conviction in the Senate unless something is. I always come back to the time when Trump said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and people will still vote for him. We're in this moment where I don't think an impeachment. I don't think that Trump has done something quote unquote bad enough that the Democrats will be able to get 8, 9, 10 Republican senators to get onto their side to vote at the trial. So that's sort of that was a long explanation of sort of the nuances there, but impeachment is on the table, but I think what's more likely is impeachment of officials within the administration. I think that is what you will see. I think that the Republicans don't have as much loyalty towards the administration officials as they do to Trump, and it will be easier and more palatable for them politically, maybe, to go after. So I think that's sort of where we would stand in 2028. But I do think that, very likely that the Democrats win the House. I'd say maybe 40% chance that the Democrats win the Senate. But, those important races, one will be in Maine, one will be in Alaska. Those are flips, right? Maine is currently represented by Susan Collins' seat is up, and Dan Sullivan in Alaska, and then this seat in Texas. And if Democrats can somehow flip those three, right? So if there's an overall Democratic swing of 6 to 8% of the vote, that puts those three Senate races in play. If it's an 8 to 10% swing towards the Democrats, all of a sudden the Senate is well in play, and so we'll sort of see, who comes out. All of it is who comes out to vote, and can the candidates get people to vote in a midterm, which is, historically has much lower voter turnout than a presidential election.
Chris, I want to say thank you for taking the time and hopping on. We dove through a lot of topics, and we definitely have to invite you on and go through them a bit deeper. But this has been an absolute blast from my side. Where can listeners reach out to you, find your work, follow you, for those interested?
Oh yeah, please just go to ecfr.eu. The U.S. program is churning out a bunch of really good work led by our boss Jeremy Shapiro, and here in D.C., and Celia Bellin in Paris, and Maida Ruga in Berlin, and then we have a new policy fellow here in Nevada, Lee, who's now in DC. That's our 3-person office. So yeah, ecfr.eu. That's where we put our stuff. And yeah, feel free to, I look forward to doing this again. And like I said, hopefully next time I'm in Barcelona, we can grab a cerveza.
That sounds like a plan. To our listeners out there, I'd like to say thank you for tuning in to Chris Herrmann here. And please write us with any comments or critiques at the Economic Podcast for Gen Z at gmail.com. We are active on Instagram and LinkedIn. Chris, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Yep. Cheers, Stefan.